Hi, welcome to another Unity from Scratch tutorial. Today we're going to look at starting to build terrains, and over the next few tutorials we'll start adding different things to the terrain such as sky and fog and snow and things like that. But first of all we need to create this terrain. So I've got a default 3D environment set up with a directional light and a camera as it comes. And I've also brought in the, let's find it, assets, import package, environment. So that will have things like trees and water and other bits and pieces that are useful for when you're creating an environment. And I've also grabbed hold of this Ionic texture pack of textures. Now you can find this on my website in the resources directory. So that's holistic3d.com/resources. This texture pack I've been using for many years. And a guy called Ionic, or who called himself Ionic, had a website where he offered all of these free textures. Now, that doesn't exist anymore. So as far as I know, I'm the only person on the web that still has a copy of these available. So thank you to whoever created them, because they're beautiful, seamless textures. Now, if you don't want to use these, you can, of course, source your own online, and cgtextures.com is another good spot to find textures. Right, so let's get started. First of all, we need a terrain. So to create a terrain, it's right-click in the hierarchy, 3D object, and look for terrain, which is just here. Now, this will give you a great big flat area. Let me just turn the light on in this scene so we can see it too. It's absolutely enormous. If we were to put a cube onto this scene, you'll be able to see how big it actually is. So a default cube in the Unity environment is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. So here's our cube. If I just zoom in on it, you can see it there. And compared to the environment, it's quite small. If I'm moving it down to on the ground, we can just see it down there. Okay, so that's the size of 1 meter, and that's compared to the entire terrain that you can see here. Now, if you want to make that terrain bigger, you can do that, and that is in the settings for the terrain. The terrain is a very special object in Unity because it has its own built-in editor and sculptor for changing the way that it looks. Now, when you've selected the terrain in the inspector, you'll see all of these little tools that we'll go through in a moment to start sculpting the terrain. But the settings is under this little cog wheel at the end. If you click on that button, there's an awful lot of settings, but down the bottom you'll find the terrain width, the terrain length, and the terrain height. Now, the terrain height is the maximum height that you'll be able to sculpt up to, which in this case is, say, 600 meters. So we've got 500 meters by 500 meter terrain. And if you want to make that bigger, you can change these values just here. And then that will change the size of the terrain. Okay, so we're just going to work with that for now. I'm just going to delete my cube because I don't need that anymore. And I'm going to move the main camera to look at the terrain so I can just align with view. Now, most of the work's actually going to happen in this scene view, so I can just make this game view a bit smaller. Alright, so what are we going to sculpt? Well, first of all, we need some kind of inspiration. Now, because I want to show a number of different techniques over this next few lots of videos, we need something that's quite complex, that has lots of different elements in it. Now, one place on Earth that I absolutely adore is Lake Louise. So I've got myself a picture of Lake Louise that we'll use as a reference. So let's create in our scene a quad. So if I go 3D object, quad, and then we need to actually find that quad, which is most likely going to be very small. There it is. And I'll put this picture of Lake Louise onto it. Then we just need to resize it. Now we'll delete this image later, but while we're creating our landscape, I want it to be in the scene. So it really needs to be as big as our landscape, which is going to be huge. Okay, so when you've got your reference picture, let's just move that up like that. And now we have our terrain here and our reference up here, and we can start sculpting. Now, we're only looking at Lake Louise from one particular direction, so it's not going to be perfectly accurate. If you wanted it to be more topographically accurate, then you could go and look on Google Earth to get those sorts of dimensions from other angles. But let's just work with this. Right, so to begin with, the terrain is at its lowest point. Okay, so it's 0 in height all over. That means we need to start pulling the terrain up out of the ground. Now, if we're going to create this series of mountain ranges across the back here, we'll want to be pulling up around this area. We're going to leave the lake area sort of just in here with some parts at the front which are also lifted up. Now, just before I start sculpting, I'm going to set the quad material, the shader, to an unlit texture. That will make the image on the quad show up much brighter, so it won't be affected by our directional light that we have in this scene. And the directional light is what essentially becomes the sun. And we don't want shadows on this particular plane because we're only using it as a reference. Right, so let's start pulling up this terrain out of the ground. Okay, so clicking on the terrain in a hierarchy, we want to use these buttons. The first button is going to lift the terrain up. So if you select that particular button, you will see you have a whole series of different brushes that you can use. So there's a star brush. Not quite sure what that purpose of that would be, but if you click on the surface, you'll see that you can start lifting up stars out of it. Now, if you don't want these, if you hold down the Shift key at the same time as you're clicking, they'll go away. Now, we probably want to start lifting up with something like this sort of brush here where it's a bit opaque around the edges. And you can change the brush size, make it much, much smaller. Or you can change the opacity of the brush. The opacity is how much influence the brush has as you're brushing. So if you have it on full opacity and then you brush, you're going to get a much stronger effect happening than if you have it down low. It's only going to do very small amounts at a time. And on 0, you're getting absolutely nothing. So if I just go up to 5, you'll see that it takes a lot more effort and brushing around to get that up. So that's good for the details. Okay, now again, I don't want this, so I'm going to hold down the Shift key and just erase this. What you can also do if you want to get everything back to 0, you can go to the next tool on the thing, and this allows you to set the height, and we can actually flatten it with this flatten button to get rid of everything. With it set to a particular height, you'll get constant heights when you use the brush on the terrain. And again, we don't want that, so let's just flatten it and go back to our other brush. Right, so let's have a look at these mountain ranges in the background. Oh, I'm going to turn up my opacity. Now you'll notice if you hold the brush over any particular point for long enough, it'll start to add height and add height and add height to itself. And don't forget, you can just use the Shift key if you want to bring it back down again. Okay, so let's just spend a bit of time now sculpting this terrain to get it to look like that. Now that we have our basic layout, If you want to actually smooth off some of the areas, you can use the next brush here with the little droplet above it, and that will smooth the height. And you can go back over the terrain and actually smooth between. This is actually quite smooth anyway. If you used a quite jagged brush type to create it, such as maybe this one here, go back to add some sort of bumpiness into that there that you can see, which you might want, I guess, if you've got snow going on things. But to smooth out that kind of bumpiness, you can use a smoothing brush to get rid of it. Let's turn the opacity up so we get some effects going on. Okay, so there you can see now that smooths that out. So while we're here, I might just add a little bit of bumpiness detail to the sides of these rock faces, which might be a little bit severe. But, you know, they are quite jagged rocks. This surface here is covered in trees, so it's not necessary that it looks that harsh. But rock faces are quite harsh anyway. All right, so that's not too bad given the time that I've had to pull this together. Now you'll notice I've brought this down here to the shoreline that we will have for where the lake goes as well. Right, so now that we have this terrain, it's time to texture it. So to put the textures on, we use this paintbrush tool here. Now the paintbrush tool will use any of the textures that you load in it. Seamless textures are going to be the best because they need to tile over the whole terrain. Okay, so to add your first texture, you click on the Edit Textures button, Add Texture. Then you'll get this little pop-up box here where you can add in your albedo color and also a normal map if you have it. Now I don't have any normal maps for my images. I'm just going to use the first texture value here. So when you click on select, you'll get a pop-up box come up to give you a whole bunch of images that you can select from. Now this terrain is a lot of rock, as you can see in the background there. So we might go for something between these two textures, and I think maybe this one's probably the best. So if I add that, double click it to get rid of it, and then add, you can see that it's not letting me add it because there's an error message saying texture wrap must be set to repeat. To fix that, which you might also incur as well, let's just open up these images. Now I can immediately see by the little arrow that's next to all of these textures that they were imported as sprite images, which is not what we want. And you might find this does occur when you try and bring them in. If I can select all of these, shift select all of them, I can now change them back to an actual texture. I'll just get rid of this window over there. With them all selected, over in the inspector you want to set the texture type to texture and the wrap mode to repeat. And this is what the editor was complaining about just before. Now if I apply that, it should turn all of our sprites back into normal textures that we can use on this terrain. Now you might have brought your textures in and they won't have automatically turned into sprites, and that's fine. But I find that sometimes, depending on how the project has been opened, is that you will get sprites when you actually wanted textures. Okay, so now that that's been fixed, let's bring back our little window for our texture adding, and you'll see that that warning that I had has gone away. At this point you can also set the metallicness and the smoothness of the texture, which I'm not going to do. I'll just leave this at size 15 as well and go add. Right, now as soon as I've done that, you'll see that the texture has been added to the terrain and it has tiled. Now it is a seamless tiling texture, but from this distance out here you can see each of the tiles. Now what sort of texture you use and how much it tiles will depend on where you're going to be looking at your game from. So if we're sort of down here, zoomed in looking up at these mountains, imagine that we're a player looking at this. Do you want it to look like that, or do you want the tiles to be bigger or smaller? So from this point, we can now just play around with this texture and click on edit to edit that texture that is selected. It'll have a blue line under it. And now you can change this size. So let's put it at 50/50. And that has made that texture much larger before it tiles. And you can see that you now can't see that tiling as much in here. And as we zoom out, we still can't really see it. But at this point, if you're doing an aerial shot, you can see it down here, which is not a problem because this is where the water is going to be and it's going to have a different texture in it anyway. But I quite like the look of the effect that we're getting up here with that size. So we'll just leave it like that. Okay, so we can apply that. Right, so you'll also notice that that first texture you add, you end up with it all over, which is fine. So let's add the riverbed in, or the lake bed, which will be sand. So we can add a new texture by going edit texture, add texture. And this time we'll look for a sand type of image that might be at the bottom of the lake. Let's go with a white sand. Double click and go add. Now you'll notice it doesn't get added all over the terrain, which is what you want not to happen, I should say. So we then select that and then we can paint it on. So anywhere there's going to be the lake bottom, then you want to paint this sandy texture on. And again, you can see the tiling occurring in it. And you might want to fix that based on how close you're going to be to it. Right, so when you're also adding the textures, you can change again your brush size if you want to have quite close detail, the opacity and the target strength as well. The target strength will determine how much overlap you get between these textures. And if you have a look close up here, get my brush out of the road, where the rock and the sand meet, they blend together, which is what you want. You don't want a harsh edge, otherwise you're going to be able to see that. And you can control how much of that blending happens from one texture over the top of the other with your target strength. So if you only want a little bit of the sand showing through over the top of the rock, then you would set the target strength down much lower. Right, so with all of those settings, you can now start to build up the textures on the terrain. So that's not too bad. That'll do for now. What you'll have noticed as I was building this is that I keep referencing what's going on in this particular scene. So if you have a look at the way these rocks are actually formed, they're formed in these layers. So you get a different sort of stripiness going across them here. And the way that snow actually falls and I guess sort of flows down the side of the mountain, as well as this dirt at the bottom here, you can see that you can paint those flows in. So you have to take a lot of your cues from nature and the way that things end up looking just based on the geology of the actual landscape to get it realistic. Now, the next part we're going to do for more realism is to actually add some vegetation in. Now, one mistake people do make when they start adding trees to their landscapes is they put them all over the place. But if you look in nature, trees aren't all over the place because they can't grow everywhere. So if you want it to look natural, then you're going to have to put trees where trees will grow. And in this case, if you have a look at this image of Lake Louise, if I can bring that back up again, you'll see that this mountain slope here, which is a much lower altitude than these rocky areas here, has a lot of trees all over it. Whereas these parts here, which are rock, so trees aren't going to grow on rock anyway, and they're also not going to grow up in that sort of high altitude snow area. So you're going to have a zone in your landscape where you will have vegetation. And not particularly in this scene, but in other country sort of scenes, you'll find you have different vegetation at different altitudes. So that's another thing to look out. So these little clues from nature will help you create something that looks way more realistic. You'll be happy to know that you can paint trees onto the terrain. You don't have to place each one by hand. You can, of course, place objects by hand onto your terrain if you like, but painting a whole heap of trees is far easier. So we want to put some pine trees on this part of the terrain here. Over in the terrain editor, you're going to click on the little tree icon, and this will allow you to add trees. So in the same way that you add textures, you also add in your objects for your trees, bushes, other sort of vegetation as well. So if you click on edit tree, add tree, you can then find your tree game object. Now, if you have imported that environment package that I pointed to earlier on, you will already have some trees. And there's a conifer tree in there that we're going to use because it's the only one, but that will do us. So let's add that. Double click on it, add, and that conifer tree will appear in these trees here. So we can now paint these trees on. Okay, so you also have a brush size, you have a tree density, you can also have random tree heights, and you can change what those heights will be here, the minimum and maximum, which will allow you to create a nice sort of realistic looking forest. So if I start clicking here, okay, those trees are probably far too large to be realistic on this particular terrain. Let's just move this down a bit. And now they're probably a little bit too small, so it might take a little bit of time to get this sort of value right. Now, if you want to remove trees, it's hold down the shift key and you just brush over the top of them. Okay, that's not too bad. Probably not as green as I'd like, but that's not the point right now. So let's just add trees all over this section. And you can make that as dense as you like. As you zoom out from it, which isn't actually happening in this case, if you can get far enough away from the trees actually won't render, and so therefore it's saving on processing time. And you can set the distance that trees will render back in the settings. So in the settings here, if we just have a look through these here, you'll find under tree detail and objects is a tree distance. Now this is set to the full so you can see all the trees. And if I put it down to 0, you see that those trees actually disappear. So by setting this distance, if it's at full of 2000, then you're going to see all the trees all the time. But if you're a character and you're sort of standing right down here and walking into the forest, there really is no point drawing the trees that are right up here. So you can actually set this tree distance much lower to get better performance from your game. If you start painting your trees on and you can't see the trees, then the most common problem will be that your distance isn't quite right. You're not close enough. The other thing, if you just look at these trees, as we zoom out to about there, you can see that they've kind of gone a bit fuzzier, and that's the level of detail working on those trees for us. So Unity automatically replaces the high quality tree with a lower quality tree, so to save on polygons. All right, so that's our trees. I'm just also going to add just a few trees on the other side with a smaller brush. with much less density. Now, you could spend a lot of time putting lots more trees on here, but let's just move ahead to get this landscape pretty much finished. The next thing you want to add is more detailed objects. So if you click on the next button next to trees, you can add paint details such as little billboard objects like little flowers and grass and that type of thing. And again, it's the same process where you add a grass texture in the edit details. Now, by grass texture, you don't just have to add a grass, but you can also add little flowers and that type of thing. Now, looking for your grass texture, it's going to look like a billboard, which is a flat texture with grass on it. And with our environment pack, we should have got some ones that we can use. Okay, so here's some grass fronds, ones that we can use. You don't want that sort of grass. You want the billboarded grass that looks like grass, because that's the image it's going to put on the little billboards. So let's grab that one. And you can also change its width and height and its color if you want as well. But let's just leave the default. Okay, so with this grass now selected, we can paint some grass on here. And you can see that grass, whoops, get up close to it, appearing. Now, grass is going to appear around the sort of the rims of the lake, and you could probably come back and add this later. Now, see how I'm brushing back here and you can't see it? That's again because the camera's culling it out, because otherwise it's just going to be too intense for the processor if you've got that many billboards going on. So now it's just a matter of going around and adding that grass where you want the details. And that goes for little flowers and things too that you can add into there. Now, if you want this grass to move when you're walking around on the environment, you can go back into your settings for the terrain, and there's a wind settings for the grass that you can set here, and this will bend and sway the grass based on some particular wind speed that you add into here. Right, so just the last thing I want to cover, I won't put you through the agony of watching me put grass everywhere. I'm going to add some water because we've got a lake. Right, so the water will have come with the environment pack, which will end up going down into standard assets. Now, if we look through here, we'll find that there is a water basics package. We're going to use that, and we're looking for a prefab. There is a daytime water and a nighttime water. If we grab hold of the daytime water and put it here, it's going to be very small. Hit the W key just to bring that up. And use the R key to actually make it way bigger. Now, it is pink, and that's because of the version of Unity I'm using and the version of the water that comes from that package download, which is quite unfortunate. So the water is particularly flat, so you can move it up and down, and while it's pink, it's actually quite easy to see. And you can work out where your shoreline is better by moving that water, and then you can come back and paint detail around these edges. So you can put a different color for the sand here, and you can also put the grass and the reeds and things as well. Now, what's going on with this pink water is something that's in the shader that we have to fix. So if you get water that looks like water from this, you're lucky you've got the right version of Unity. But in this case, I've got pink. So we need to fix the shader. To do that, if you go into the project and have a look for water, we're looking for the basic water shader, which is going to look like one of these rainbow colored things. So I think it might be this one. If you double click on it and open up the code, you'll see that right at the top there's a note that says upgrade note replaced this value with this value, and because it's done that, or because someone has done this, it's not working. we actually need to go back and replace this with this. And I believe it's just in one spot. If we just go down to here. So this is on line 43. I'm just going to remove that. And it's object 2 world with a number 2. And just save that and switch back to Unity. And you'll see that that water has now worked for us. Now, if you don't like that color, because it's not quite what you would call Lake Louise type color, then you can play around with these different colors here. Lake Louise is a far more vibrant blue, isn't it? Okay, so now we have our water and we have our scene. All that we need to do now is add maybe a few more detailed textures and a few more detailed trees and grass and that type of thing before we can start looking at the sky, clouds, and adding some snow. And that will come in the following tutorials. So thanks for listening, and I hope you have fun with the Sculpting terrain editor tool.